Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're jumping right into a really fascinating study based on a video called Is America Babylon by Ken Johnson from the Bible Facts channel. Just a quick heads up, the link to that original source is right down below the video, so definitely check that out for yourself. Now, we're unpacking a mystery that's literally captivated people for decades. I mean, with all the global instability today, it's really no wonder people are looking at ancient texts and asking, wait, is the U.S. the mystery Babylon in biblical prophecy? And if so, does that mean it's doomed to some sudden fiery destruction? It's a huge question. To get to the bottom of it, we're going to see how this study decodes ancient prophecies, tracks historical migrations, and uses some pretty subtle linguistic clues to map out our modern world.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's exactly how we'll break it down today. First, the mystery of Babylon. Then, decoding the ancient nations. After that, the Gog and Magog War. Then we'll look at a timeline of prophecy. And finally, America's prophetic fate.
Section 1. The Mystery of Babylon.
So before we figure out if America is Babylon, we got to understand what that term actually means, right? This is the big high-stakes question Ken Johnson tackles right out of the gate. There's this massive theory out there that the U.S. is the Babylon mentioned in the book of Revelation. And look, when you consider modern geopolitics, the extreme wealth, the unmatched military, the huge cultural influence of the U.S., it's super easy to see why people make that connection. Because of that assumption, a lot of folks think the U.S. is destined to be completely wiped out early in the end times timeline, maybe by a sudden nuclear strike from places like Russia or China. But the study asks us to kind of pump the brakes here and look a little closer at the actual ancient text to see if that literal interpretation holds water.
So, the crucial point is this. According to the analysis, Mystery Babylon isn't a single physical nation like the USA, and it's not a single city like New York. Instead, it's defined as a worldwide commerce network, a global religious system based entirely on inescapable economic dependency. Ken Johnson points out that the Antichrist uses this interconnected, highly digitized global commerce system to gain absolute power without ever needing to march a traditional army across borders. Think about it. If nations are entirely dependent on a centralized system for survival, for their oil, supply chains, digital currencies, they can be controlled without a single shot being fired. The presentation reveals that it's only much later, right in the middle of the prophesied tribulation, that a coalition of 10 nations finally turns on this Babylon system and destroys it to seize that economic power. So if America is just one piece of this massive global puzzle, it wouldn't be destroyed early. It would actually stay prosperous and just get deeply entangled in this global web.
Section 2. Decoding the ancient nations.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we figure out where the U.S. fits into all this. The presentation takes us back to Ezekiel chapter 38. But reading Ezekiel takes some serious detective work. You have to translate ancient biblical people groups into modern geography. The study meticulously traces the grandsons of Noah to their modern lands. For example, the first-century historian Josephus noted the ancient Greeks called the descendants of Magog the Scythians. These were nomadic people who settled in the southern Russian steppes. So Magog points heavily toward modern-day Russia. Then we've got Gomer and all his bands. The analysis links this lineage to Germany and Austria. Actually, the presenter points out that the fall of the Berlin Wall allowed the fractured bands of Germany to reunify, completely fulfilling the prerequisite for this prophecy. Moving down, Togarmara geographically maps to Turkey. Sheba and Dedan perfectly match the ancient coastal city-states around Saudi Arabia. And finally, the merchants of Tarshish. Now, in Hebrew, this roughly translates to Tin Man. And let's be real, controlling ancient tin mines meant you basically controlled the Bronze Age tech sector. The primary hubs for tin were Spain and Great Britain. Since Tarshish is so closely tied to naval power, the historical record identifies Tarshish as Great Britain.
So what does Great Britain have to do with America? Well, the Ezekiel prophecy specifically mentions Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. The presenter breaks this metaphor down. Young lions essentially translates to colonial cubs. Britain obviously had colonies everywhere, India, Canada, South Africa, but the linguistic nuances of the Hebrew phrase point to a specific, unified group of these young lions that banded together to form an independent global power. That uniquely describes the 13 colonies that broke away to form the United States. And that's exactly how the study deductively locates the U.S. in these ancient texts.
Section 3. The Gog and Magog War.
And this brilliantly illustrates the specific conflict outlined in Ezekiel 38. The presentation makes a really careful distinction here. The Gog and Magog War is entirely separate from the Battle of Armageddon. Unlike Armageddon, this specific geopolitical drama has three very distinct sides. First, the invaders. That's a massive coalition led by Russia, joined by Iran, Libya, parts of Africa, Germany, and Turkey. Second, the bystanders, Saudi Arabia, Great Britain, and the Young Lions, the USA. According to the text, these Western and Gulf nations don't engage militarily at first. Imagine the tension. They're basically watching this unfold from the sidelines, sending strongly worded protests, asking Russia, "Have you come to take a spoil?" And third, the target, modern Israel. The prophecy notes this invasion only happens after the people are brought back from a worldwide dispersion, pointing firmly to events after 1948, when they are dwelling peacefully in unwalled villages.
Now, a common objection here is the ancient weaponry mentioned, things like horses and arrows. If this is a modern war, why are they riding horses? But Ken Johnson provides a truly mind-bending linguistic detail. The Hebrew word often translated as horse is sus, which literally means a leaping thing, or something that glides swiftly over obstacles. Think about an ancient visionary suddenly seeing a 21st century battlefield. A modern drone strike, low-flying cruise missiles, armored tanks. They literally wouldn't have the vocabulary for aerodynamics or combustion engines. In that context, an army of leaping things flying over walls describes modern mechanized warfare absolutely perfectly. Kind of changes how you read the text, right?
The analysis also highlights Ezekiel 38:17. Here, God asks Gog, the leader of this massive invasion, if he's the one spoken of in old time by former prophets. The presenter argues this rhetorical question strongly implies there are extra-biblical prophecies that predate Ezekiel's writings. This matters immensely because it adds layers of ancient validation. Ken Johnson points to texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Gad, and the Ezra Apocalypse. He argues these texts actually laid the groundwork for these exact alliances centuries before Ezekiel even wrote them down.
Section 4. A timeline of prophecy.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this logically builds. By piecing together Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, and those extra-biblical texts, the study constructs a pretty dense chronological story. Phase 1 starts with a major, localized conflict between Iran and Israel, resulting in significant slaughter. Following that, Phase 2 ushers in a highly deceptive, temporary era of peace and safety. Israel essentially lets its guard down. And it's exactly during this vulnerable time, Phase 3, that the Gog and Magog war, that Russian invasion, drops. This is a super crucial distinction. The Russian invasion happens way before the true tribulation period really kicks off. The global shock from this war creates a massive power vacuum, which leads directly to Phase 4, the rapid rise of a revived 10-nation Roman Empire. Finally, in Phase 5, the Antichrist rises, consolidates power by reducing the empire from 10 nations down to 8, and eventually destroys the global economic system of Mystery Babylon.
To further explain this historical transition of power, the source turns to the Ezra Apocalypse. This ancient text features a wild vision of a three-headed eagle, representing the ongoing permutations of the Roman Empire. The left head represents Western Rome, which evolved into the Holy Roman Empire of Europe. The middle head was the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, which completely disappeared in the early 20th century. The right head? That represents the Russian Empire, whose czars literally considered themselves the true successors of Rome. According to the text, the right head eventually absorbs or dominates the left head. Historically and prophetically, this means Russia gains undeniable influence over Europe, but ultimately, all three heads are destroyed in coming conflicts, leaving only the body and claws to form that final end-times confederacy. And those remaining claws are incredibly significant. The presentation points out that by cross-referencing Daniel and Ezra, this final global confederacy starts with 10 nations, symbolized by the 10 toes of Daniel's statue or the 10 talons of Ezra's eagle. But it doesn't stay at 10 for long. It's violently reduced to 8 when the Antichrist steps onto the world stage. He doesn't ask nicely for control. He aggressively rips out 3 existing leaders, removes them from power, and inserts himself as the absolute head of a newly consolidated 8-nation alliance. Section 5. America's prophetic fate.
So we have to bring all this deductive mapping back to our original question. After tracing those colonial young lions, identifying the ancient tin merchants, and watching the bystanders sit on the sidelines of a global war, what is the final prophetic verdict for the United States? According to the study by Ken Johnson, the answer carries a really heavy, almost tragic irony. The U.S. is not the literal Mystery Babylon destined for some early, sudden nuclear annihilation. Instead, as the Young Lions, the U.S. remains a wealthy, intact superpower during the early stages of these conflicts. During the Gog and Magog invasion, America survives, protesting Russia's actions from the sidelines through diplomatic channels rather than being wiped off the map. However, the study heavily emphasizes that simply surviving the early military scares doesn't mean America is in the clear. Far from it. The US avoids the bombs, only to become inextricably entangled in that eventual global economic system. It gets completely absorbed into the true Mystery Babylon, a system built on centralized digital commerce, global IDs, and inescapable financial dependency. It's a slow surrender of sovereignty to an overarching digital bureaucracy, which, honestly, in many ways is way more insidious than a traditional military defeat.
And that leaves us with a truly haunting final thought. When we look at our smartphones, the push for digital IDs, centralized commerce, and international tracking, we really have to ask, are the lines of national independence blurring, exactly as these ancient scrolls described thousands of years ago? Whether you look at this study through theology, history, or modern geopolitics, it provides a structured worldview that is just hard to ignore. Now, the full presentation by Ken Johnson goes even deeper into these texts, so definitely check out the link directly below the video to explore it for yourself. Thanks for joining me on the study today. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.